Okay, so thinking about the autonomic nervous system, and before I forget, I'm going to paste a link here for the slides. So our first objective is to describe the anatomy of the two branches of the autonomic nervous system. Now, before we get into the autonomic nervous system, I kind of want to take a step back and talk about where this fits into what we have described so far. So when we think about the nervous system, we have central and peripheral. Central, we said, was brain and spinal cord. Peripheral, we said, was everything outside. Now, as far as looking at the peripheral nervous system, we can further divide that into autonomic and somatic. So when we think about autonomic, these are all our automatic functions. It's funny that those two words are very similar, autonomic and automatic. So automatic meaning that these systems are not under our voluntary control. These functions, things like our heart rate, blood pressure, contraction of smooth muscle in the vasculature, contraction of smooth muscle in the gastrointestinal tract, all of that is controlled automatically by the autonomic nervous system. And so that's going to be one branch of our peripheral nervous system. The other branch is going to be somatic, and we'll talk about that coming up in chapter 12. But the somatic nervous system is going to be skeletal muscle specifically. So these are things that we can voluntarily control. These are structures, you know, and functions that we can make a decision about, like movement, right? I can think about moving structures, moving my limbs, and then I can make those actions. But with the autonomic nervous system, that's kind of a hidden nervous system. These are kind of the things that are happening in the background. All right, that we do not have control over. So if we look more closely, kind of zoom in here at the autonomic division of the peripheral nervous system, we can then once again, subdivide the autonomic nervous system into sympathetic and parasympathetic. And we'll talk about what those mean in just a sec. So the autonomic nervous system is having two divisions. Both are innervated by neurons that are coming from the central nervous system. And these are going to govern or control things like our effector organs. So again, glandular tissue, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, etc. It's going to be a portion of the nervous system that operates in what is known as comparative secrecy, which means that there's somewhat of an antagonistic function happening between the two divisions. So comparative secrecy means that if I increase parasympathetic, sympathetic goes down. If I increase sympathetic, parasympathetic goes down. So there's somewhat of a competition happening or antagonistic function happening between the parasympathetic and sympathetic activities. Parasympathetic nervous system will control rest. We typically refer to this as the rest and digest division of the autonomic nervous system, whereas sympathetic nervous system is going to be your fight or flight response, okay? Sometimes that's even considered fight, flight, or freeze, or fight, flight, or fawn, the fawn effect, which is where you kind of stop in, or freeze in mid-action. Now, this division is going to manage a multitude of unconscious processes. So once again, things that we're not cognitively aware of, like blood pressure, our temperature, our acid-base balance, all of those unconscious processes that we're not thinking about are also important for homeostasis, but they're going to be controlled by the autonomic nervous system. And so it's really important to think about the autonomic nervous system as being a crucial part of maintaining homeostasis. And that feedback loop that we talked about, going from the sensors, receptors, up to the integrating centers and out to effector organs, the effector organs that we're speaking about are going to be these autonomic effector organs. So here's a schematic that just shows what that comparative secrecy looks like. So when we talk about the effector organs that are under control from the autonomic nervous system, they're the same glands and organs, right? But they're getting innervation from both divisions of the autonomic nervous system. So the glands, the lacrimal glands, as we can see here, that produce tears, the salivary glands that produce salivary secretions, the function of the lungs, not only the smooth muscle lining the bronchial tree, right, the trachea and bronchi, but also the actual smooth muscle out in the lungs and the alveoli themselves, the heart muscle, and the SA and AV nodes here, the liver, glands in the liver, the stomach, the glands of the pancreas, the spleen, right? All of these organs, the genitalia, bladder, etc., will all receive innervation from the sympathetic, which will help to increase some of the functions that align with fight or flight or freeze, as well as the parasympathetic, which will help to increase some of the functions that align with rest and digest. Also, secretory functions. So when we talk about rest and digest, we're going to increase glandular secretions, which will align with that digestive process as well. So this is what is meant by comparative secrecy. Both divisions are innervating all of these glands and organs in the middle here. And depending on what function is needed from the body, we can increase sympathetic and tone down parasympathetic, or alternatively, we can increase parasympathetic and tone down sympathetic. The other piece to remember here is the general anatomy and how they differ, how that anatomy differs from the sympathetic side to the parasympathetic side. So on the sympathetic side, the specific structures, the specific anatomical location of the cell bodies that give rise to the neurons on the sympathetic side come from the thoracolumbar segment of the spinal cord. So T1 all the way through to L2. So this is where these sympathetic nerves will originate from, and then they will travel out and they'll synapse either at the sympathetic chain or at collateral ganglia, which are ganglia that are not a part of the sympathetic chain, or the third option would be the adrenal medulla. And we'll talk about those three options, but they're really important as far as where the sympathetic nerves will synapse initially, and then they will give rise to a secondary neuron. On the parasympathetic side, those anatomical structures where the parasympathetic nerves arise from will be the cranial nerves, 3, 7, 9, and 10, which will arise from the brain stem of the spinal cord, as well as the sacral spinal nerve, so S2, S3, S4, which will arise from the lower segments of the spinal cord. So these are things to really keep in mind and to commit to memory is sympathetic T1 to L2, parasympathetic cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, 10, as well as S2, S3, S4. All right. Okay. Now, when we think about, again, the general anatomy of the autonomic nervous system, there are two neurons in series. So there's a preganglionic neuron, there's a ganglia, and then there's a postganglionic neuron. And so the communication from the preganglionic neuron to the postganglionic neuron is a synapse, and we call that synapse a ganglia, an autonomic ganglia. So basically, a ganglia will be wherever we have synapsomas and cell bodies that exist outside of the central nervous system. So this would be an example of the autonomic ganglia, where there's a presynaptic or preganglionic neuron, and then that synapse, and then a postganglionic neuron. Okay, again, these are some examples of the effector organs that we're talking about, but we just looked at the full list there, but cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and smooth muscle is found in several locations throughout the body. So we think about endothelial cells, we think about the bronchial tree, we think about the gastrointestinal tract, we think about the reproductive tract, the urinary tract, the bladder, all of that will have smooth muscle. Glands will be, again, all throughout the body. We have our gastrointestinal glands like the liver, the pancreas, but also salivary glands in the oral cavity. And then we can think about the reproductive, like the ovaries and testes as being glands as well. So those will also be under control by the autonomic nervous system. And then lastly, adipose tissue. So adipose tissue is another example of effector organs that will be controlled by sympathetic and parasympathetic. Okay, so here's an illustration of the autonomic ganglia. So here's our central nervous system being brain and spinal cord. Here is our preganglionic neuron, And then here we have a synapse that's happening outside of the central nervous system. So we're going to refer to this synapse as a ganglia. And then this specifically will give rise to the postganglionic neuron. And then the postganglionic neuron will then innervate effector organs, which again can be anywhere throughout the body: cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, glands, and adipose tissue. So this is the general layout of the communication from the central nervous system to the autonomic ganglia to all of these effector organs that are out in the periphery. The thing that I want to make clear here is that the length of these two neurons will differ significantly depending on whether we're looking at the sympathetic nervous system or whether we're looking at the parasympathetic nervous system. And so we'll talk about how the length of these two neurons and the anatomical location of these two neurons differ in those two divisions of the nervous system.